We're here today for the official launch of the BA World Languages at UCC. The first intake of students began their course in September 2014. And on the occasion of the official launch, we have with us in the studio today Professor David Crystal, academic, writer, broadcaster, author of over 100 books, including the Cambridge Encyclopedia of Language. And we're going to take this opportunity to speak to David about the status of language study today. So, David, I have a few questions for you. Given the status of English as a global language, what do you see as the value of studying other languages?
Well, I remember George Steiner, the literary critic, once saying about other literary critics, you must study another language because that's the main way of learning the defining contours of your own. And so there is that element in it, that everybody needs a contrast in order to understand their own state of affairs. And the more that you can study different languages, the more you'll understand about your own language. So that's reason number one, and it's an important reason, especially for people who are monolingual in temperament and they can't see the point at all. They'll learn a lot about their own language from studying even just one other language. But then the other side of it, of course, is learning the other languages as a way of developing your understanding of what it means to be human. There are something like 6,000 languages in the world. There are languages dying at the rate of one every couple of weeks on average. And each of these languages gives you a unique vision of what it means to be human in the culture and the part of the world where that particular community grew up and evolved. And when you look at these other languages, and even if you take only a short step into them, you suddenly get perspectives about life, the universe, and everything that you wouldn't get just by looking at your own language. And so you end up, when you study other languages, becoming a fuller, a more rounded human being, it seems to me. And given that both then your own mother tongue, or mother tongues, and these other languages are all part of your individual personality as time goes by, seems to me that there's an unassailable case for looking at other languages.
Thank you. Ireland, you may or may not know that Ireland is currently engaged in a consultation process with regard to the development of a national language policy. What would you see as the key principles behind such a policy?
Yeah, national language policies vary like chalk and cheese as you go around the world, of course. Well, it's got to, the primary principle is it's got to reflect the realities of language use. And there are two main forces that drive a language always. One is the need for intelligibility. We have to understand each other. And I don't just mean within a country, but I mean talking to the rest of the world. And that means lingua francas and all the rest of it. And the second main force that drives language is the need for identity. So people have a language or a dialect of a language to show who they are. Now, when you look at the languages of the world and the countries of the world, what you often see is these two aims in conflict, and you get a lot of disturbance as a consequence, usually because the identity aim has been left subordinate to the intelligibility aim. And so minority languages and minority peoples in particular often find that their individuality is not recognized officially by the authorities. And that causes trouble. When you look at the way languages turn up in the headlines of the newspapers of the world, it's usually because some minority group is fussing, quite rightly, about the lack of status devoted to their individual language. And so all this can be avoided very nicely if both identity and intelligibility are built into the language policy as axioms, as it were. This sort of a balanced multilingualism is the only efficient way to run a language policy, it seems to me. And then, of course, one has to take into account the cost of it all. I mean, it's all very well having a nice ideal language policy which gives due recognition to all the language communities that are part of the country. But of course, that's expensive. and something, money is not indefinite, and so something's got to give. So it's a tricky business, evolving a language policy that will satisfy everybody, especially in a very mobile state of the world where incomers are arriving from all over the place and significant numbers are growing up. I mean, imagine London, with over 300 languages spoken there, language communities. I mean, how on earth do you cope with all of that when it comes to things like driving tests and health tests and all of this sort of thing? So something usually has to give, and it's quite a tricky thing to implement a language policy in practice. But at least the principles have to be laid down clearly. And in a case of Ireland, which has had so much incoming communities over the last, 10, 20 years, I can imagine that there's all sorts of pressures now to try and evolve some sort of policy that will give sensible recognition to everybody that's part of Ireland these days.
Of course, increasingly there's discussion of the way in which multilingualism is a resource, not just an expense, but that it can actually enrich in even in utilitarian terms.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. I mean, people have to remember what multilingualism is. It is the natural human condition. 3/4 of the world's population is naturally bilingual. Half the world's population is naturally trilingual. Go to Africa and you'll find it perfectly normal to have 5 languages, 4, 5, 6 languages in various communities, which doesn't mean to say that each language is commensurate with every other, in the sense that you have to translate everything from one language into the others, like a kind of a European Union language policy often is. No, these are just languages that are being used for whatever purpose they need to be, with as much fluency as you need to have. And everybody lives perfectly happily ever after as a result of being allowed to use these languages in the circumstances in which they find themselves. And so when you get that kind of situation, multilingualism is a huge benefit, because it means that you can make contacts, develop relationships, exercise influences in a multiplicity of different directions in a way that a purely monolingual person would not be able to do, let alone the tourist impact, of course. If you've got a lovely multilingual situation, because what does multilingualism mean? It means multiculturalism as well as multilingualism. And it's multiculturalism that attracts the tourists. So you come into a place and you go to Switzerland, for example, and Romansh might be the least, in a sense, of the 4 languages in terms of numbers, but it has the greatest fascination for tourists. And so, if you can capitalize on that, you're in a strong position.
Okay. Following on from that, Ireland has a bilingual policy which, however, is frequently being called into question. You live in Wales, which has a similar bilingualism. Is there anything that you think, are there any aspects of the Welsh language policy that you think represent good practice?
Yes, I think Welsh is the success story of the 20th century when it comes to endangered languages, really. And certainly, compared with the other Celtic languages, Welsh is done far better. And it's interesting to ask the question why, because there was a similar activism in many places. But something happened in Wales. The activism that developed in the 1970s was focused very much on the ordinary person's interests, and focused particularly on the need for a Welsh television channel. S4C, S4C, and it succeeded, not without a great deal of controversy and hunger striking on the part of the leader of the campaign at the time, when the Thatcher government reneged on its promise to set up a television channel, but they did in the end. And what does a television channel do, or a local radio station for that matter? It brings the language into the home, into the local community, in a way that no other option is able to do. In other words, what you shouldn't do really is assume that if you teach the language in a school, you're going to end up with a success story, because that doesn't work. I mean, it helps, of course, but it doesn't take the language out of the school and onto the streets and into the home. I mean, I learnt Latin in school, but what use was that in any practical sense, And I think a number of the Celtic languages have been taught in the schools without enough attention being paid to how you bring the language out into the real world and onto the streets and into the home. Assuming it's already there, you see, but of course it's only there to a limited extent. Well, things have changed. I know that there is now several broadcasting mediums in Ireland which does the same thing. TV Brege in Brittany started a few years ago, but this was very late compared with Wales. And so, Wales has had this kind of grassroots awareness of language for something, for half a century almost now, and it's one of the factors, I think, which has caused the Welsh language to grow and grow and grow. So I think that's one factor. The other factor is that there has to be a mutuality of respect between the different sectors of the community that are using the minority or endangered language. And by that I mean the old generation and the young generation. Now, even in Wales, this hasn't been entirely successful. A language survives only insofar as the next generation takes it up. It's called intergenerational transmission, isn't it? If the young people are not turned on to the language, a language can die within a generation very easily. And so it's very important that when the elders of a language-speaking community take responsibility for the language and try to develop it in the way that it will survive, that they don't penalise the young people for speaking the language in a different way from the way that they speak it. And of course, this is what's happened, that the young people, especially, I know Wales only, I don't know the Irish situation, but I bet it's very similar. The young people are into the internet and all of this, and they know, just like every other modern language community around the world, that English is the coolest language because it's the language of the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and all of this. And so they want to bring these English words and expressions into their usage, and this is being condemned by the elders as being, Wenglish, a Welsh kind of English, or, you get all these mixed terms reflecting what the older people feel is letting the language down. But as far as the young people are concerned, this is the new form of the language that they want to take forward. And if there isn't some sort of rapprochement between these two groups, then I fear for the future of the language, actually, because the young people are simply going to say, well, blow that then. I'll just carry on with the coolest languages, which are English, etc. And they drop the ethnic, the ancestral language completely. So what I hope is that any language policy gives due respect to the different varieties or dialects or styles that make a healthy language grow without condemning them. And if you bring that in alongside the other point I was making, then I think you've got a very healthy future in store.
Mm-hmm. Okay. How do you think language teaching should be approached in schools? And do you consider there to be a place for the study of grammar?
Oh, grammar is absolutely essential in any kind of language teaching situation. I mean, people have a bad understanding of what grammar is. Grammar exists to make sense of words. That's its purpose. A word by itself does not make sense. If you take a word out of the dictionary, a word like table, for example, I say to you, table, now you know what I mean. But you don't know what I mean. Does table mean a piece of furniture? Does table mean something you write in a book with rows and columns? Does table mean a mountain in South Africa? What does table mean? And you have to put it in context in order to find out what it means. Now, what does putting it in context mean? It means put it in a sentence, and then we will know what you mean. So if I say to you, the leg of the table is broken, you know what I mean. If I say to you, I spent all morning climbing the table, you know what I mean. So sentences exist to make sense of words. Words by themselves do not make sense. Words have got too much meaning. They're ambiguous all the time. Sentences resolve the ambiguity, and grammar is the study of sentences. So the aim of grammar is to actually allow us to make sense to each other. There is no other way. And so the more you study grammar, the more you understand all the basic issues to do with communication, such as how do you maintain a clarity of meaning? How do you avoid ambiguity? How do you say something in the most effective way? All these notions of clarity, disambiguity, effectiveness, and all the others are all conditioned by your ability to use grammar efficiently. And so the more you can understand, the more you understand about grammar, the better position I think you are in to achieve those goals. Now, understanding about grammar does not mean, and this is the fallacy that's out there, learning all the parts of speech, being able to label all the parts of speech and things like that, and being able to analyse a sentence into the subjects and the verbs and the objects, and that's the end of the story. No, that's the beginning of the story. That's a bit like saying, are you... do you know about cars? Oh, yeah, I know about cars. I can tell you all the bits of a car. I can tell you that's a wheel, and that's a steering wheel, and that's a brake. But I can't drive, actually. Or I don't know how to drive, or I don't drive very well. Just because you know the bits of a car doesn't mean you're going to be a good driver. And it's the same with grammar. Just because you've learnt the technical terms and all the rest of it doesn't mean to say you're going to be a good user of grammar. On the other hand, if you don't know any of the technical terms or any of the bits of the car, you're not going to be able to drive at all. So, same with grammar. It's a balance between the two, between structure and use, always. I can't conceive of an efficient language course which doesn't have a good, solid grammatical foundation, but it's got to be the right kind of realistic grammar, otherwise it becomes stultifying and boring and dead and learn it off by heart. And there are 9 types of adverb phrase: yawn, yawn, yawn. So what? Well, I mean, some people are interested in that. Some people love doing grammar analysis like they love jigsaw puzzles. There are some people like that, but for most people, grammar has to be made more realistic.
Okay, thank you. What do you think of the new BA World Languages at University College Cork?
Well, it's unique, isn't it? I have never come across a course like it, and I've seen many a course around the world. It has a breadth of a range which I think is unprecedented, or pretty nearly so anyway. The ability of the student to mix and match, as it were, is a great offering. So often, when you do a language course, you're driven down a particular alleyway, and you have to do that, and then you have to do the other, and that's all you can do. And because the two areas are being studied in huge depth, you gain, of course, from that depth, but you lack a certain breadth. It seems to me that in the modern world, everybody is so mobile, and the interactions are so great, and the competitiveness of economies and businesses and so on is so multifaceted, that breadth is more important than depth, insofar as one has to make a choice. Eventually, of course, one will go into depth in certain areas, naturally, but the more you can develop a sense of the diversity of the languages of the world, the better, the more prepared I think you are to respond to the situations in which you find yourself, which are entirely unpredictable. You just don't know which sort of languages you're going to encounter next. And I think any course that can give you that kind of breadth of vision that your course does, I think you're preparing the students better for the realities of the world, linguistic world that we have today, than any other. So I'm very excited by it, and I wish it all the best.
Yes, thank you very much. What advice would you have for students considering a degree in languages?
Well, as far as the intrinsic interest of the subject is concerned, approach the subject with no preconceptions. What am I thinking of here? I'm thinking sometimes of the conflict that there is between language and literature, for example, that you still find in many departments around the world, where the language section and the literature section don't talk to each other at all. They're just different worlds. Yes, he's interested in literature. When I did my degree, it was a lovely 50-50 Lang and Lit mix. So I would study Shakespeare in the morning and phonetics in the afternoon, and this was mutually informing. And I've always wanted to see that kind of complementarity of subject in language departments generally. And so if one can maintain that kind of balance, there are all sorts of balances, aren't there? There's the Lang-Lit balance. There's the history-present-day balance, making sure that the history of the language is an essential part of the mix, and not just the modern language. And conversely, of course, there's modern language there, not just the history side. Once upon a time, there were some courses where you only got history, you got precious little modern. It's maintaining this balance between all these things, because when you go out into the real world after you've finished your course, it's a real world in which all these mixes impact you straight away. You go into a business and you take some job or in the civil service or whatever it might be, and you just don't know what they're going to throw at you. And so the more you're prepared for this, the more you are into the diversity of the languages that you're studying, by which I mean not just many different languages, but by many different varieties or dialects of the language. In other words, you've seen it all, and literature is one of the best ways in which you can get a sense of the diversity within a language as well as between languages. The more if you've got all that under your belt by the time you leave, then they can throw anything at you and you've seen it already, or you've seen bits of it already, and you're ready to handle it.
Oh, thank you very much, David Crystal. Thank you very much for watching. Contact information is at the end of the film.